Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in to Cheating Tales Lab. We got another awesome story for you, and we hope you enjoy every moment. So let's jump into the story and get things rolling. Jake's boots hit the driveway with a soft thud as he climbed out of his truck. The weight of a grueling 24-hour shift hung on his shoulders, his turnout gear reeking of smoke and sweat. He fumbled with his keys, the metal cool against his calloused hands. The house was quiet when he entered. No TV noise, no clattering of pots and pans from the kitchen. Just silence. Jake's instincts, honed by years of assessing dangerous situations, prickled at the back of his neck. He found Melissa sprawled on the couch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other loosely gripping her phone. Her chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. Jake's eyes lingered on her face, taking in the soft curves he'd memorized over their years together. A pang of tenderness tugged his heart, quickly followed by a wave of exhaustion. As he turned to head upstairs, a faint buzz caught his attention. Melissa's phone screen lit up with a new message. Jake hesitated, his Boy Scout ethics warring with a nagging sense of unease that had been growing for weeks. The message preview was just visible. "Mom, I can't keep this up anymore. Jake's not the father. I never meant for it to go this far, but I couldn't lose him. What do I do now?" Jake's world tilted on its axis. The room spun, and he gripped the back of the couch to steady himself. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words glowing on the screen. Each syllable was a dagger, piercing through the life he thought he knew. Melissa stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, focusing on Jake's face. A slow smile spread across her lips, but it faltered as she registered his expression. "Jake, what's wrong?" Her voice was thick with sleep. He held up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Care to explain this?" Melissa's eyes widened, darting between Jake's face and the damning message. Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. "It's not. I can explain," she finally managed, pushing herself up to a sitting position. Jake's voice was low, controlled. "Explain what?" "How you've been lying to me. How this child isn't mine." Melissa's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, Jake. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake." "Who?" Jake demanded, his composure slipping. Melissa looked away, her shoulders hunched. "Alex," she whispered. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Alex, his childhood friend, the best man at their wedding, the godfather to their adopted daughter. "How long?" Jake's voice was barely audible. 6 months, Melissa admitted, tears streaming down her face. "It just happened, and then I found out I was pregnant, and I was scared, and I thought if I just pretended." Jake cut her off with a raised hand. He couldn't bear to hear more. His mind was reeling, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "Our marriage is over," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Melissa reached for him, her face a mask of desperation. "Please, Jake, we can work this out. I love you. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." Jake stepped back, out of her reach. "There's nothing to fix, Melissa. You've destroyed everything we had, everything we were supposed to have." His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where the weight of betrayal sat like a stone. As he turned to leave the room, Melissa called out, her voice breaking. "What about the baby?" Jake paused at the doorway, his back to her. "That's not my problem anymore, is it?" Without another word, he walked out, leaving Melissa sobbing on the couch. The next morning, Jake sat across from Sarah Blackwood, a sharp-eyed divorce attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness. The office was all polished wood and leather, a stark contrast to Jake's rumpled appearance. "So, Mr. Buford," Sarah began, her pen poised over a legal pad, "you want to initiate divorce proceedings before the birth of a child?" Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, and I want to contest paternity." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And you have evidence of your wife's infidelity?" Jake pulled out his phone, sliding it across the desk. "Text messages, credit card statements showing hotel bookings, everything's there." As Sarah scrolled through the information, Jake's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at it, his firefighter instincts kicking in. A massive wildfire had broken out in the nearby national forest. "I'm sorry," Jake said, standing abruptly. "I have to go. Duty calls." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We'll continue this later. I'll start the paperwork based on what you've provided." Jake rushed to the fire station, his personal turmoil pushed aside by the urgency of the situation. As he donned his gear, he overheard snippets of conversation from his fellow firefighters. "Poor Jake," one voice murmured. "Can't believe Melissa would do that to him." With Alex of all people, another chimed in. "Talk about a betrayal." Jake froze, his hands stilling on his helmet strap. The affair had been an open secret. His friend, his colleagues, they had all known. The realization was like a second betrayal, compounding the pain of Melissa's infidelity. Swallowing hard, Jake pushed the thoughts aside. There was a fire to fight, lives to save. He couldn't afford to be distracted. As the team headed out, sirens blaring, Jake's mind shifted into professional mode. The personal could wait. Right now, he had a job to do. Months passed in a blur of legal meetings, work shifts, and sleepless nights. Jake threw himself into his job, taking on extra shifts and volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. His colleagues worried, but none dared to confront him directly. The day of the baby's birth arrived with a sense of inevitability. Jake stood outside the maternity ward, his heart a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to rush in to see the child he had spent months preparing for. Another part wanted to turn and run, to pretend none of this was happening. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Buford, we're ready to perform the paternity test." Jake nodded, his throat tight. He followed her into a small room, where a technician waited with swabs and vials. The procedure was quick, clinical. Jake barely felt the swab against his cheek, his mind far away. Days later, Jake sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the results. The words swam before his eyes, but their meaning was clear. He was not the father. Sarah's voice cut through the fog in his mind. "Jake, we need to discuss our next steps. With these results, we have a strong case for paternity fraud." Jake looked up. "Do it. File the lawsuit. I want Melissa to face consequences for what she's done." As Sarah made notes, Jake's phone rang. It was his financial advisor, sounding panicked. "Jake, I don't know how to tell you this, but there's been some unusual activity in your investment accounts. It looks like someone's been using insider information to undercut your property investments." Jake's mind raced, connecting the dots. Alex was a real estate developer. Melissa had access to all of Jake's financial information. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. "Thank you for letting me know," Jake said, his voice cold. "I'll take care of it." As he hung up, Jake turned to Sarah. "We need to add something to the lawsuit. It seems Melissa and her lover have been busy with more than just their affair." Sarah's eyes gleamed with the prospect of a more complex case. "Tell me everything," she said, pen at the ready. Jake began to speak, laying out the web of deceit that had ensnared him. As he talked, a plan began to form in his mind. Melissa and Alex had tried to destroy his life. Now it was time for Jake to fight back. The acrid smell of smoke clung to Jake's turnout gear as he trudged into the fire station. His eyes were bloodshot, his face etched with exhaustion. The wildfire that had been raging for weeks showed no signs of abating, and Jake had been working double shifts, pushing himself to the brink. As he made his way to his locker, he overheard snippets of conversation from the chief's office. "Need a new captain. Someone who can handle the pressure. What about Buford? He's been putting in more hours than anyone." Jake paused, his hand on his locker door. He hadn't been gunning for a promotion, but the idea settled in his mind like a spark in dry tinder. 2 days later, Jake stood before the chief, accepting the captain's badge with a mixture of pride and determination. As he pinned it to his uniform, he couldn't help but think of Melissa and how she would have reacted to this news in a different life. The thought was like a splash of cold water, reminding him of the betrayal that had brought him to this point. Jake threw himself into his new role with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He pored over city plans, studied fire patterns, and drilled his team relentlessly. If anyone noticed the dark circles under his eyes or the way his hands sometimes shook from too much coffee and too little sleep, they didn't mention it. One afternoon, as Jake was reviewing permit applications for new construction projects, a familiar name caught his eye. Alex Development Corporation. The company was seeking approval for a major project on the outskirts of town, right in the path of the still raging wildfire. Jake's jaw clenched. He could almost hear Alex's smug voice, pitching the project to investors, using information he'd gleaned from Melissa to undercut Jake's own investments. Without hesitation, Jake reached for his red stamp. Application denied, he muttered, bringing the stamp down with more force than necessary. Insufficient fire safety measures. It wasn't a lie. The plans were shoddy, clearly rushed. But Jake knew he was letting his personal feelings influence his decision. He paused, pen hovering over the denial form. Was he any better than them if he abused his position like this? After a moment's hesitation, Jake set the pen down. He wouldn't stoop to their level. Instead, he pulled out a fresh form and began detailing exactly what changes would be needed for the project to meet fire code. It would delay Alex's plan significantly, but it would be above board. As Jake worked, his mind drifted to the insider trading he'd uncovered. He'd been sitting on that information for weeks, unsure of how to proceed. Now, with his new position and the respect it commanded, he saw a way forward. That evening, after his shift ended, Jake sat in his truck in the station parking lot. His finger hovered over the send button on his phone. The email was addressed to the SEC, detailing Alex's suspicious trading activities and providing documentation. It was all anonymous, of course. Jake had been careful about that. He took a deep breath and pressed send. As the email whooshed away, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was fighting back, but he was doing it the right way. The next morning, as Jake drove to the station, he noticed the plume of smoke on the horizon had grown larger. The wildfire was creeping closer to town, an ever-present threat looming over everything. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had a job to do, both as a firefighter and as a man seeking justice. And he'd be damned if he let either the fire or his personal demons win. Jake's phone buzzed insistently on his nightstand, pulling him from a fitful sleep. He glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. His heart rate spiked, anticipating bad news about the fire. But the name on the screen made his blood run cold for a different reason. Melissa. He let it ring, watching as the call went to voicemail. A moment later, a text appeared. Jake, please. We need to talk. It's important. Jake stared at the message, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to continue cutting Melissa out of his life. But another part, a part he hated, still cared. Before he could decide, another text came through. I'm outside. Please, just 5 minutes. Jake cursed under his breath. He threw on a t-shirt and jeans and made his way downstairs, steeling himself for whatever was to come. Melissa stood on his porch, looking small and vulnerable in the dim light. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair disheveled. For a moment, Jake felt a pang of concern, quickly followed by a wave of anger at his own weakness. What do you want, Melissa? His voice was gruff, sleep-addled, and annoyed. She flinched at his tone, but pressed on. Jake, I know I've hurt you. More than I can ever make, right? But please, I'm begging you, can we talk? I've ended things with Alex. For good this time. Jake's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. And that's supposed to make everything okay? You lied to me, Melissa. You tried to pass off another man's child as mine. You betrayed everything we built together. Melissa's eyes welled with tears. I know, and I'm sorry. I was scared and stupid and selfish. But Jake, we have a history. We have Emma. Can't we try to work this out? For her sake, if nothing else. At the mention of their adopted daughter, Jake felt his resolve harden. Don't you dare use Emma as a bargaining chip. You lost that right when you decided to cheat. That's not what I meant, Melissa protested, reaching out as if to touch Jake's arm. He stepped back, out of reach. I could never trust you again, Melissa. Don't you understand that? Every word out of your mouth, every action, I'd always be wondering if it was another lie, another betrayal. Melissa's face crumpled. What can I do? Tell me what I can do to make this right. Jake shook his head. There's nothing you can do. It's over, Melissa. I've been documenting everything. Your affair, your erratic behavior, everything. I'm going for full custody of Emma. The color drained from Melissa's face. You can't do that. She's my daughter, too. I can and I will, Jake said, his voice low and determined. Emma deserves stability, not a mother who lies and cheats without remorse. Melissa's demeanor changed in an instant, her pleading expression morphing into one of anger and desperation. If you do this, I'll ruin you. I'll tell everyone what a cold, unfeeling bastard you are. How you pushed me into Alex's arms with your long hours and emotional distance. Jake felt a chill run down his spine at the venom in her voice. This was a side of Melissa he'd never seen before, and it only reinforced his decision. Go ahead, he said, his voice steady. Tell them whatever you want. The truth will come out in the end. He turned to go back inside, but Melissa's voice stopped him. This isn't over, Jake. You'll regret this. As he closed the door, Jake leaned against it, his heart pounding. He knew Melissa was right about one thing. This wasn't over. But he was prepared for whatever came next. The courthouse loomed before Jake, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the battle he was about to face. The custody hearing for Emma was scheduled for today, and Jake felt the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. As he climbed the steps, he spotted a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Sarah Blackwood, his attorney, cut an impressive figure in her tailored suit. Her expression was grim as Jake approached. We've got a problem, she said without preamble. Melissa's team is throwing everything they've got at us. They're painting you as an absent father, too dedicated to your job to be a proper parent. Jake's jaw clenched. That's rich, coming from a woman who cheated on her husband and tried to pass off another man's child as his. Sarah held up a hand. I know, and we'll counter that. But there's something else. We've uncovered some interesting information about Melissa's finances. Jake's eyebrows rose. What kind of information? Sarah glanced around, then lowered her voice. It seems Melissa has been embezzling funds from the charities she works for. We're talking substantial amounts over the past year. Jake felt a mix of shock and a sort of satisfaction. Can we use this? Sarah nodded. We can, but we need to be careful. If we present it in court, it becomes public record. That could jeopardize the charity's reputation and potentially harm the people they help. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He thought of the people the charity helped, the good work they did. Could he really expose that, even if it meant winning custody of Emma? What if we reported it anonymously? Jake suggested. To the charity's board, not the court. It's the right thing to do, and it might force Melissa to step down without dragging the charity through the mud. Sarah considered this for a moment, then nodded. That could work. It would certainly strengthen our case if Melissa suddenly lost her job due to financial impropriety. As they walked into the courthouse, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was fighting for Emma. Yes, but he was also fighting for what was right. The hearing was grueling. Melissa's lawyers painted Jake as a workaholic, too busy fighting fires to be a proper father. They brought up the long hours, the missed school events, the times Jake had to cancel plans because of work emergencies. But Jake's team was prepared. They presented evidence of Jake's involvement in Emma's life, homework help over video calls during his night shifts, rearranged schedules to attend her dance recitals, the special daddy-daughter days he planned on his days off. As the judge called a recess, Jake stepped out into the hallway for some air. He was so lost in thought that he almost collided with someone rounding the corner. Watch where you're going, hero, a familiar voice sneered. Jake looked up to find Alex standing before him, a smirk playing on his lips. Jake's fists clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body tensing for a fight. What are you doing here, Alex? Jake managed to grind out. Alex's smirk widened. Just supporting a friend. Melissa needs all the help she can get, dealing with a vindictive ex like you. Jake barked out a laugh. Vindictive? That's rich. Coming from the man who slept with his best friend's wife, and then used insider information to try to ruin him financially. Alex's smirk faltered for a moment before he leaned in close, his voice low. Speaking of that, I've got a proposition for you. Drop this custody nonsense, forget about the insider trading, and there might be something in it for you. Say, a generous investment in your name? Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was Alex really trying to bribe him? In a courthouse, no less? You're unbelievable, Jake said, shaking his head. Do you really think you can buy your way out of this? Alex shrugged, his confidence seemingly unshakable. Everyone has a price, Jake. Even Boy Scouts like you. Think about it. This could all go away. You could have your life back, plus a little extra. All you have to do is walk away. For a brief moment, Jake was tempted. Not by the money, but by the idea of this all being over. No more court battles. No more sleepless nights worrying about Emma's future. But then he thought of Melissa's betrayal, of Alex's smug face, of the life he'd built being torn apart by their actions. Not everyone has a price, Alex, Jake said, his voice steady. Some of us still believe in doing what's right. As Alex opened his mouth to respond, Jake held up a hand. This conversation is over. And for the record, I've recorded every word of it. Add attempted bribery to the list of charges you'll be facing. The color drained from Alex's face as Jake walked away, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He hadn't actually been recording, but Alex didn't need to know that. As he rejoined Sarah outside the courtroom, Jake felt a renewed sense of determination. He was going to win this, not just for himself or for Emma, but for every person who'd ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air as Jake stood at the edge of town, his eyes fixed on the approaching wall of flames. The wildfire that had been raging for weeks had finally reached the town limits, its orange tendrils licking at the outskirts of the community he had sworn to protect. Jake's radio crackled to life. "Captain, we've got civilians trapped in the old mill on Maple Street. The fire's cutting off their escape route." Jake's jaw clenched. The old mill was a death trap, a relic from a bygone era that should have been torn down years ago. But there was no time for should-haves now. "Copy that," Jake responded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm on my way. Tell Johnson to bring the ladder truck around back. We're going in through the roof." As Jake raced towards the mill, his mind couldn't help but drift to Emma. His daughter was safe, evacuated with the rest of the town's children, but the thought of her kept him focused. He had to make it back to her. The mill loomed before him, smoke pouring from its windows. Jake could hear the screams of the trapped civilians, even over the roar of the fire. Without hesitation, he strapped on his breathing apparatus and began to climb. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, years of training kicking in as he navigated the treacherous, burning structure. He found the first group of civilians huddled in a corner, terrified but alive. "Follow me," Jake shouted, his voice muffled by his mask. "Stay low and move quickly." One by one, he guided them to safety, passing them off to his team, waiting on the ladder truck. But as he turned to make one final sweep, he heard a faint cry from deeper within the building. Jake knew he should wait for backup, knew that every second he stayed in the burning mill increased his own danger. But that cry galvanized him. He plunged back into the inferno. He found her in what must have been an old office, a young woman no older than 20, her leg pinned beneath a fallen beam. The fire was closing in fast. "Hold on," Jake said, positioning himself beside the beam. "This is going to hurt, but I need you to pull yourself free when I lift this, okay?" The woman nodded, tears streaking her soot-stained face. Jake gritted his teeth and heaved, muscles straining against the weight of the beam. For a moment, he thought he wouldn't be able to do it, that they'd both die here in this burning hell. But then the beam shifted, and the woman scrambled free. Jake scooped her into his arms and ran, the building groaning and creaking around them. They burst out onto the roof just as the floor gave way behind them, flames licking at their heels. As they were lowered to safety, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. Jake barely heard them, focused only on getting the woman to the waiting ambulance. It wasn't until he felt a hand on his shoulder that he looked up. The fire chief stood there, a look of pride on his weathered face. "Damn fine work, Captain," he said. "You just saved a lot of lives today." Jake nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. But as he looked around at the grateful faces of those he'd rescued, at his team who had followed him into danger without hesitation, he felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The local news crews descended on him like vultures, shoving microphones at his face and peppering him with questions. Jake answered as best he could, deflecting praise to his team and focusing on the importance of fire safety. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Jake couldn't help but think of Melissa and Alex. He wondered if they were watching, if they saw the man they had tried to destroy standing tall, a hero to the very community they had threatened to turn against him. But those thoughts were quickly pushed aside as the reality of the situation set in. The fire was still raging, and there was work to be done. Jake turned back to his team, ready to face whatever came next. Little did he know, across town Melissa and Alex were indeed watching. And they were plotting their next move. In the days that followed, Jake's face was plastered across every local news outlet. "Hero firefighter saves dozens in daring rescue," the headline screamed. Jake tried to avoid the attention, focusing instead on the ongoing efforts to contain the wildfire and protect the town. But the public adoration was impossible to ignore. People stopped him on the street to shake his hand or offer thanks. Local businesses put up signs praising the fire department, with Jake's name often singled out. It was during one of these encounters, as Jake was picking up coffee for his team, that he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Did you hear about that firefighter captain?" One woman whispered to another. "I heard his ex-wife is saying he was negligent, that he put lives at risk." Jake froze, his hand hovering over the cream dispenser. He listened intently as the women continued their gossip. "No," the other woman gasped, "but he's a hero. He saved all those people." The first woman shrugged. "That's what I heard. Apparently, there's evidence in everything. His ex and her new man brought it to the fire chief this morning." Jake's mind raced. Melissa and Alex. Of course, they couldn't stand to see him succeed, to see him overcome the mess they had made of his life. They were trying to discredit him, to tarnish his reputation just as it was at its peak. He left the coffee shop in a daze, his mind whirling with possibilities. What kind of evidence could they have fabricated? And more importantly, how could he prove it was false? As he approached the fire station, he saw a cluster of his colleagues gathered outside, speaking in hushed tones. They fell silent as he approached, exchanging uncomfortable glances. "What's going on?" Jake asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew. One of the younger firefighters, a rookie named Tommy, stepped forward. "Cap, there's some people here from the department. They're asking questions about the mill fire." "About you?" Jake nodded, his jaw set. "Thanks, Tommy. I'll handle it." As he walked into the station, Jake steeled himself for what was to come. He had faced down raging infernos, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. He could handle whatever Melissa and Alex had thrown at him. Inside, he found the fire chief and two stern-looking men in suits. The chief's face was a mask of concern and disappointment. "Jake," he said, his voice heavy, "these gentlemen are from internal affairs. They have some questions about your conduct during the mill fire." Jake straightened his back, meeting their gazes squarely. "Of course," he said. "I'm an open book." For the next 2 hours, Jake answered question after question. They grilled him on his decision-making process, on the risks he took, on every minute detail of the rescue operation. Through it all, Jake remained calm and composed, his responses clear and honest. As the interrogation wound down, one of the IA men produced a folder. "We have some documentation here," he said, his tone neutral. "Maintenance records showing faulty equipment, reports of understaffing, even a suggestion that you were intoxicated on the job." Jake's eyes widened. The accusations were so outlandish, so far from the truth, that for a moment he was speechless. But then, as he looked at the documents, a detail caught his eye. A signature, hastily scrawled at the bottom of one of the forms. He'd know that handwriting anywhere. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the folder. The IA man hesitated, then nodded. Jake flipped through the documents, his firefighter's eye for detail, catching inconsistencies and errors that someone unfamiliar with the department's procedures might have missed. And there, on nearly every page, were little tells, Melissa's distinctive, Alex's habit of dotting his I's with a dash instead of a point. He looked up at the IA men, a smile on his face. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think you've been had. These documents are forgeries, and I can prove it." For the next hour, Jake methodically went through each piece of evidence, pointing out discrepancies and errors that proved they were fakes. He called in members of his team, who corroborated his version of events and vouched for his character and professionalism. By the time he was done, even the IA men looked convinced. The fire chief's face had transformed from disappointment to anger, not at Jake, but at those who had tried to smear one of his best men. "I want a full investigation into the source of these documents," the chief growled. "And Jake, I owe you an apology. We should have trusted you." Jake nodded, accepting the apology with grace. But inside, a fire of his own was burning. Melissa and Alex had crossed a line. They hadn't just attacked him personally this time. They had put his entire team, the whole department, under scrutiny. They had jeopardized the trust that the community placed in its firefighters. As he watched the IA men leave, their tails between their legs, Jake made a decision. It was time to end this, once and for all. He had been playing defense for too long. Now it was time to go on the offensive. The courthouse stood imposing and austere, its stone facade a silent witness to countless human dramas. Today, it would bear witness to the culmination of Jake's long struggle against betrayal and deceit. Jake straightened his tie, a gesture more of nervousness than vanity. Beside him, his lawyer, Sarah Blackwood, gave him a reassuring nod. "We've got this, Jake," she said, her voice low and confident. "The evidence is overwhelming." Jake nodded, but said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Melissa and Alex had one last trick up their sleeves. They had proven time and again that they were willing to go to any lengths to destroy him. As they entered the courtroom, Jake's eyes immediately found Melissa and Alex. They sat on the opposite side, Melissa's face a mask of feigned innocence, Alex's set in a sneer of defiance. Jake felt a momentary surge of anger, quickly suppressed. He couldn't let emotion cloud his judgment now. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Sarah presented their case methodically, laying out the evidence of Melissa's infidelity, paternity fraud, Alex's insider trading, and their recent attempt to discredit Jake with forged documents. Jake watched as Melissa's composure cracked, her eyes darting nervously around the room as the weight of her actions was laid bare. Alex, for his part, maintained his arrogant demeanor, but Jake could see the beads of sweat forming on his brow. When it came time for Jake to testify, he spoke clearly and calmly, recounting the betrayal he had suffered and the struggle to rebuild his life and protect his daughter. As he spoke about Emma, he saw a flicker of something, regret, shame, cross Melissa's face. The defense's case was weak, full of excuses and attempts to shift blame. Jake could see the judge's expression growing increasingly skeptical as Melissa and Alex's lawyer grasped at straws. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat. Having reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented, "I'm prepared to render my decision," he began, his voice grave. Jake held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "In the matter of custody for the minor child, Emma Buford, I hereby grant full custody to the plaintiff, Jake Buford." A wave of relief washed over Jake. Emma was safe. She would be with him, away from the toxic influence of Melissa's betrayal. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, in the matter of the paternity fraud lawsuit, I find in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant, Melissa Buford, is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $500,000. Jake heard Melissa's sharp intake of breath, saw her reach out to clutch Alex's arm. But the judge still wasn't done. "Lastly, I am referring the evidence of embezzlement and insider trading to the district attorney's office for further investigation and potential criminal charges." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jake sat still, almost unable to believe it was over. They had won. Not just won, but triumphed completely. As the judge's gavel fell, bringing the proceedings to a close, Jake finally allowed himself to smile. He turned to Sarah, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Sarah smiled back. "You did the hard part, Jake. You stood strong in the face of it all. Now go be with your daughter." As Jake left the courthouse, he was met by a crowd of reporters, all clamoring for a statement. For a moment, he considered brushing past them, eager to get to Emma. But then he stopped, facing the cameras squarely. "Today, justice was served," he began, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." He paused, thinking of the long, hard road that had brought him to this point. "I'm grateful for the court's decision, but the real victory here is the truth coming to light. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a daughter to hug." As Jake walked away, leaving the reporters calling questions behind him, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just the legal battles that were over. He had faced his demons, had stared down the betrayal and pain, and had come out stronger. Later that evening, as Jake sat in his living room, Emma curled up asleep beside him. He thought about the future. The settlement money was substantial, more than he had ever expected. An idea began to form in his mind. The next morning, Jake made a call to his lawyer. "Sarah, I need your help setting something up," he said. "I want to use part of the settlement to start a support group for men who've been through similar situations. Paternity fraud, betrayal, false accusations. I want to help them fight back, to know they're not alone." Sarah's voice was warm with approval. "That's a wonderful idea, Jake. I'll get the paperwork started right away." As he hung up the phone, Jake felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. He had won his battle, but there were others out there still fighting. He could help them, could use his experience to guide them through the darkness he had emerged from. For the first time in months, Jake allowed himself to truly relax. He had his daughter, his integrity, and a new mission. Melissa and Alex were facing the consequences of their actions. The future, which had seemed so bleak not long ago, now shone bright with possibility. Little did Jake know, the final act of this drama was yet to unfold. Melissa and Alex, backed into a corner and facing ruin, were about to make one last, desperate move. The fire station was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, the air thick with a lingering smell of smoke from the now-contained wildfire. Jake sat at his desk, poring over reports and planning the day's assignments. The victory in court had energized him, and he threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. A noise from the apparatus bay caught his attention. Frowning, Jake rose from his desk. The station was staffed, of course, but most of the crew was either asleep or out on a medical call. Who could be out there at this hour? As he stepped into the bay, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Melissa and Alex stood there, their faces contorted with a mixture of anger and desperation. Alex held a gas can, the acrid smell of accelerant already filling the air. "What the hell are you doing?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief and anger. Melissa's laugh was bitter, tinged with hysteria. "What does it look like, Jake? We're burning it all down, just like you did to us." Jake's mind raced, assessing the situation. The station was old, the wood dry. If they started a fire here, it could spread quickly, endangering not just the building but the surrounding neighborhood. "Think about what you're doing," Jake said, keeping his voice calm despite the fury and fear coursing through him. "This isn't just about me. You're putting innocent lives at risk." Alex sneered, sloshing the contents of the gas can. "Should have thought about that before you ruined us. Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm facing prison. Melissa's lost everything. This is your fault." Jake took a step forward, his hands raised placatingly. "It's not too late to stop this. Whatever you're feeling, this isn't the answer. Think about Emma Melissa. What would she say if she saw you now?" At the mention of Emma's name, Melissa faltered, the manic gleam in her eyes dimming slightly. But Alex was too far gone, consumed by rage and the fear of what awaited him. "Enough talk," Alex snarled, flicking open a lighter. The small flame danced, a harbinger of the destruction to come. Jake's training kicked in. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward, tackling Alex to the ground. The lighter skittered across the floor, its flame extinguishing. Melissa screamed, the sound piercing the pre-dawn quiet. The commotion roused the sleeping firefighters. They rushed into the bay, taking in the scene with professional speed. "Call the police," Jake shouted, struggling to keep Alex pinned. The man fought like a wild animal, all reason gone in his desperation. Melissa stood frozen, the reality of what they'd almost done crashing over her. As two firefighters moved to restrain her, she offered no resistance, her eyes locked on Jake and Alex's struggle. In their frantic scuffle, Alex's elbow caught the gas can, knocking it over. Fuel spilled across the floor, the fumes rising thickly in the enclosed space. "We need to evacuate," Jake called out, his voice strained as he fought to subdue Alex. "Get everyone out now." The station's alarm blared to life, its shrill cry echoing through the building. Firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, securing equipment and ensuring everyone was accounted for. As Jake finally managed to get Alex in a firm hold, he looked up to see flames licking at the spilled gasoline. In their struggle, they must have struck a spark. "Fire!" Jake yelled, hauling Alex to his feet. "Move, move, move." The evacuation was orderly but urgent. Jake, still gripping Alex tightly, was one of the last to exit the building. As they stumbled into the cool night air, Jake could hear the approaching sirens of police and additional fire units. He watched in dismay as flames began to engulf the station, the place that had been his second home for so many years. But there was no time for sentiment. Lives were at stake. With Alex secured by his colleagues, Jake sprang into action. He barked orders, organizing his team to contain the blaze before it could spread to neighboring structures. As Jake directed the firefighting efforts, he couldn't help but notice the irony. Here he was, saving Melissa and Alex from a disaster of their own making, just as he had saved so many others throughout his career. The fire raged on, consuming the old wooden structure with voracious appetite. Jake and his team fought valiantly, their movements a well-choreographed dance of hoses, ladders, and axes. Hours passed in a blur of heat, smoke, and exertion. Finally, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, they brought the fire under control. The station was a total loss, but they had prevented the blaze from spreading. Exhausted, soot-stained, and reeking of smoke, Jake surveyed the smoldering ruins. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. The fire had destroyed the physical reminders of his old life, but from the ashes, he would rise anew. He turned to see Melissa and Alex being led away in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of shame, fear, and defeat. As they passed him, Melissa paused, her eyes meeting Jake's. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the aftermath of the fire. "For everything." Jake nodded, too drained to speak. He watched as they were placed in separate police cars and driven away, out his life for good. The fire chief approached, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You did good, son. Saved a lot of lives today." Jake managed a weak smile. "Just doing my job, Chief." As the scene cleared and the investigation began, Jake found himself standing alone amidst the chaos. He pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Emma? It's Dad. I'm okay, sweetheart. There's been a fire, but I'm fine. I'll be home soon." As he hung up, Jake took a deep breath. The air still smelled of smoke, but underneath it he could detect the faintest hint of something new. Hope, perhaps, or the promise of a fresh start. He looked around at his team, at the community members who had gathered to offer support, at the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. These were his people now. This was his life. Jake straightened his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. He had weathered betrayal, fought through adversity, and emerged stronger. The fire that Melissa and Alex had set, both literally and figuratively, had not consumed him. Instead, it had forged him anew. As he walked towards the gathered crowd, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The long nightmare was finally over. He had his daughter, his integrity, and a community that stood behind him. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched before him full of possibility. Jake allowed himself a small smile. He was ready for whatever life had in store for him next. After all, he had faced the flames and emerged unscathed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would meet them head-on, with the same courage and determination that had brought him through this ordeal. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warm light washing over the scene. As Jake began to coordinate the cleanup efforts, he knew that this was not an end, but a beginning. A new chapter in a life that had been tested by fire and found unbreakable.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.